Okay, we are live. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Arrrgh Book Club. Today, we are going to be discussing the postcard, which I don't know. I've been trying to figure out how to get the book to stand. I need to fix this and have a shelf or something behind me, but we're going to be discussing the postcard by Anne Berest. I loved this. I thought this was like a perfect book for me.
I thought it was unlike any other book about the Holocaust I've ever read.
Yes.
Which surprised me.
Yeah. Exactly. Like I didn't really know 100% what it was going in. I had heard that it was about a woman researching her family history. And that was enough to intrigue me because that's like a thing that I enjoy in stories. Mm. But I had no idea like the scope of what I was getting. And it did all the things that I would want a book of this nature to do.
For sure. I listened to it. I didn't read it. And it was so interesting to me because I thought she didn't shy away from like the hard truths of things at all. But it's a really hard thing to talk about your own personal history and also be like honest and emotional in like equal measure without, it's hard to say over dramatized because that makes it sound callous on my part, but like without this veneer of like literary, this gloss on it that kind of glamorizes the, like I call it the red coat at the end of Schindler's List, this extra veneer. And I think she captured something for me that I never ever thought about. I mean, not that I didn't think about it, but like that I never fully could conceptualize, which is like everything that went before and everything that went after, like for everyone who survived, people as they were going about their, like I found it so moving. And like, see, like it brings tears to my eyes to think about these girls going to college and like thinking about how am I going to get my degree and like what's going to happen now. And like, that's exactly how it would happen, like where all these things are happening and we're like kind of news, but like your regular life is your regular life, right? Like you have this trajectory and all these dreams and plans and wandering around, thinking about like your tomato sandwich and like what grade you got on that test. And these huge things are happening in the background in this very like insidious way. And then it all just comes like tumbling down,
Yeah.
Like I thought she captured that exceptionally well because most of the books I've read on the topic either start with like kind of the dramatic events, like the full, the impact of having people taken away or raids or this or that. But this was like that long beginning.
Which I think is so important. Like I've always been like, you need to start back a ways because the way so many books start, it almost feels like it was this abrupt thing that happens. And it's never been an abrupt thing. It's always been this like slow, gradual build, which is a thing that I think so many people miss when they're reading about the Holocaust. And also the assumption that like everything after just kind of went back to normal and everyone was fine. And it's not. That's never been what it was. So like I've been like seeking out books that like delve more into the before and after because like that is something that I wished I'd read sooner in my like exposure to this. Because I don't know, the things that I read growing up were mostly like centered just on the events of rather than how they got there. And that always frustrated me, but I could never find books that went further back. So to see her take the story back and start in 1918 and have this like slow build and all the decisions that people had to make and like, how do you know when is the right time to get out? Like, it's just such a, like, we have the foresight. We're like, oh, you should not do that. You should get out of Europe entirely. And they're like, no, France will be safe. And until it's not. And so, yeah, I thought that was a really great way to tell the story. And I can't decide, like, is this a memoir? I don't know what to call it. Like, I've been trying to think. It's not a memoir exactly, but it is.
It's almost like therapy notes of like someone, you know, I thought that was another interesting thing. Like, it really captured how different people in the same circumstances react. Like, and how the generational conflict we have like shows up everywhere, like even in the very beginning where the great grandfather wanted to go to Palestine was like, I see down the line here, like
and how we don't listen. we never listen
like,
to people.
Oh man.
Because we think we know more. We always think we know more than our elders. And like, it really gives me pause. I'm like, how many times have I said something to my parents that I'm like, you don't know what you're talking about? And like, maybe they do know something.
Maybe they do. Maybe that instinct is like ringing a bell, And then other things is like sometimes the younger generation is right. Like, the registering and like just those simple acts of defiance. Like, I think she had a section there where she talked about like in times of, peace and prosperity, it's the people who toe the line, who like do the things, who fill out the forms and, send their kids to school and everything that make society run. And then in times of like unrest and turmoil, it's the people who like are like, nope, I'm not going to do anything and we're going to see how it goes from there, that actually allow, rebellion or freedom to happen. So but like you said, when do you know? Like, when do you know which one is the right choice? There's no knowing. So there's just,
I just find that aspect of it really interesting, because I've always wondered, like, why didn't people just leave? Like, why didn't you get out when you saw things going the way they were going? But how do you see that? Like, you can't know.
Yeah. My mom-in-law was actually one of the Peter Pan babies from Cuba. So she and her sister were sent to orphanages in America before her parents could make it out. And then they came later, but they were in an orphanage, I think, for like 2 years or so, and then fostered for a little bit. And I remember thinking, like, what a decision to make. You're sending your kids, like, you're like, this is like,
it's a huge risk, but like, what else can you do?
What else can you do? Like that, and there's so much of their family who disagreed, and people, that whole break of like people who stay, people who leave, like, I don't know. And I know that people joke about it with the upcoming elections here and things like that, but it is a time, I think we are at one of those times where, we can say people have like hysteria about these things, but also like, there's a lot of things. Yeah, there's a lot of like bells tolling, So.
Yeah. Definitely made me stop and think about things, like reading the book and just being like, when do you know? When is the moment that you're like, okay, maybe we should go? Yeah.
When do you stop like just waiting and getting the groceries and, doing all the normal things? But I don't know. There was something about that. Just, she captured something for me in this book that I haven't seen before, which is really that the mundane that lies beneath all of this drama. Like, you're still just a person, like navigating a first marriage and doing this and doing that in spite of everything that's happening. And then you're waiting with this like huge unknown. Like, you don't know what the next day will bring. You don't know where your family members are. You don't know whether you're in the camps or out. You were in this horrible...
not knowing. That was such... I can't even imagine like what that would have been like. Like, just the sheer not knowing where your family is, what happened to them, and then not finding out for so long, because like nobody knows what happened to them. Yeah.
And then the when they came back and the people were like waiting, to find their family members and asking like, have you seen this person? Have you seen this person? And people being like, that perspective of like, why would you ever tell them? Even if you knew, like, how do you say that to someone, like all these horrible things that might've happened, So the impossibility of the whole thing. So.
Yeah. There was, I think, the scene too at the end when they were talking about the place that they would go to find out what happened, and the mother looking for her child, and then the child didn't want to go to her. And I just, that made me set the book down for a minute. It's like, like that baby didn't remember you, and now you look so different from what you
Yeah,
would
it's
have looked like.
scary and frightening to like an adult too.
Yeah, because like I remember when I was small, I was terrified of elderly people for some reason, and so yeah, if I saw someone who looked like that, I probably would have panicked too, and yeah, that would be so heartbreaking as the mother.
Yeah. That was too much. It was a tough book.
Just,
Like it was if people like it was a tough book, but I thought the pacing was so realistic
yes,
that it was bearable in a way. You know,
absolutely,
like
yeah.
it
read just like perfect pacing. I really found the dedication to research absolutely fascinating, because like the amount of like, no, that really happened and I can show you why and how I found out, like, I don't know, I found that just amazing, because I know I had family that died in the camps, but I don't know their names, so I don't know how to find them. And the only person who knew was my grandmother, who's dead. So like I don't even know how to go about finding out what happened and who they were, and so they're all
finding
gone
like that the one, you know, the few places that didn't destroy records and things like that in France, of like the government's complicity, and it was just, I don't know, that not knowing carries, right? And also I found it striking that, you know, like her grandmother sort of like divorced herself from this identity in a self-protective way, you know, just kind of, I cannot do this, like, you know, like a shield, and then raised her children like secular, I guess, for the most part.
Yeah. And I know that was a thing that happened pretty frequently. You either they went fully into the Jewish identity or they completely separated from it. There was like no in between. You either
I didn't hear about that at all before this book. Like I didn't know that. Like I didn't know, and it makes perfect sense. I've just never read of that perspective, you know, of that history of families that, and for good reason, I guess. I mean, I think people, you know, aren't writing books about how they like forewent their history. Like they just
I just read We Were the Lucky Ones, and the author of that book was raised completely secular, didn't even know she was Jewish until she was an adult, and started digging deeper into what happened to her, and that's how she ended up writing the book. But like her family just like completely divorced themselves from religion because it was a bad thing to be. So like we'll just not be that anymore. And blend into society. Which is understandable.
I think that one of the things that, you know, struck me, I remember when I grew up with like a bunch of kids who like had bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs. So I had a lot of Jewish friends growing up, and it never occurred to me like how few Jewish people there are in the world, because I didn't grow up in an environment where there weren't any, you know? And so that, and same thing for my husband, because he grew up in Miami. So seeing Jewish people, seeing like that culture was like very common. And then when I found out, like, I don't think I ever processed that until an adult, like what the percentage is, like if you like factor out, you know, in the global population. And when people talk about anti-Semitism being like not a big deal, I'm like, by sheer virtue of the numbers alone, it's a big deal. Like it's a, you know, completely apart from any opinions you have about it. Like you cannot look at the numbers of just how many people there are and not think that it's a big deal. So
yeah, I had a very different experience than you, because I was the only Jew. Me and my brother were the only Jews in the entire school system where we grew up. So like I knew people who were Jewish because we knew from our synagogue, but like none of them went to my school. And there was only like, I don't know, maybe 20 families at our synagogue. So there wasn't that many of us. So in our general area anyway. I think if you went a little more north, there was more, but where I grew up, it was just me. I was always the only Jew. So that was always really weird and awkward.
See, for us, like I think, and it sounds really silly, but honestly, like all my Jewish friends had the best parties, because all that year of turning, like everyone turning 13 was the best. And I think it is those kinds of things, like celebrating with people of another culture, that makes you feel like everybody's the same, or like, you know, that these are like, I think the othering of people happens because of ourselves, like are the groups we belong to ourselves and the walls we draw, as well as, you know, this mystery. Like, right, this is a building I can never go in. Like, I wonder what goes on in that building, all of that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it was so great how like everything was so inclusive for everyone who wasn't, you know, like we had this like great experience and everyone was so kind. And I think that that alone is such a thing. I mean, I grew up Islamic, right? So I remember my parents being like, we are going to a lot of bar mitzvahs. And I mean, I was the only Islamic kid. I had no, like, you know, I don't know. I'm very confused about like what we do to celebrate anything at that age because we never did anything. But I don't know. I think being included is such a big thing. Like even in med school and stuff, like going to, you know, like Seder and things like that, like at people's houses. Like I think there is this organic way to build community outside of your own, you know, especially when there's this history of like fear and persecution. And I think those conscious, like, you know, bring a friend things is it's so important. Like I really do. Like I think it's those people who were like, of course we will help you. Like of course. Like how can I help people is different than the middle ground of saying like, well, you know, this might be happening, but I don't know anybody in that, you know, like there's no point of reference to be helpful, even if you're not like on the evil side of things, you know.
Mm-hmm.
There's just this like, I don't know, it's a tough thing.
Yeah, I think this book, I'm like looking at all my notes. I wrote down that I felt like this book was a tribute and a warning. Like I felt the warning portion of it pretty strongly in like the way they're talking about what's happening in France in the present day and that kind of thing. And that like when people don't pay attention, when people are desensitized to the idea of what's happening, and are more willing to look away, then that's when things can get really bad. And like, I just want to stick this book in everybody's hand and be like, read this. This is important. You should read this book.
Yeah, it was such a quiet book, but also so gripping.
Yes.
You know?
Yes.
It was.
I was very absorbed. Like it's a pretty long book, but I think I only read it in like 3 days because I just like could not stop.
Yeah, I listened to it continuously on Audible, which also very rarely happens. Like usually I flip around even on Audible. Like I'm like, well, we'll go to this and we'll go to that. But this one I just read straight through. Yeah, it is very, I don't know. I thought she did a really masterful job of making it very personal, like a personal story of her own experience with this and unfolding this history, but also like sharing, you know, her mother's perspective, her grandmother's perspective, her great grandmother's perspective in all these little ways, you know. So
yeah, definitely. I thought it was a beautiful way to show that a bad thing happened, but it happened to people and it happened to normal people, ordinary people. Like, yeah, I loved that she talked about how Noemi wanted to be a writer. And then this book felt like her way of honoring that. And I just thought that was very beautiful.
Yeah. And even how that novel, I mean, I won't say it because it's like a spoiler, but there's like beautiful things about the continuity, you know, when you think about like this maternal memory, you know, we always talk about like that trauma that's passed down, but I also think there could be good things passed down, right?
Yeah.
Like these characteristics of how we see the world and how we want to show up in it.
Yeah. Yeah, I also wrote down that I thought this was it was a really interesting look at generational trauma in a way that I don't think I've ever seen it done before. Like I've read books where that was a thing that happened in the story, but like the way that she like goes back and like even in her own life and showing like all these moments in time when she could pinpoint things. And I don't know, I just thought that was fascinating and really well done. Yeah, I don't know. I really liked that part of the story, like where she's unpacking this mystery and like I don't know, it felt very raw and vulnerable to expose herself that way. I don't know. I thought it was really
very deeply personal. That's what and that's almost what I mean about not putting this gloss. I thought it was very well written, like very readable, very well written, very moving, but without like a literary conceit, you know? Like it was like reading a diary, you know, like when we write in journals or whatever. Like sometimes even when I go back to my young journals, like I'll see like a line which is like literary conceit. Like I can tell, like I thought about that line, you know, like I thought about how that would sound. But then there's a lot where I'm just writing, you know, I'm just writing my thoughts. And this felt like the journal of a very good writer, not like the writing from journals, you know, like this felt like I was reading the first take, like her true like notes about things as she was finding out about them, you know, like this unedited kind of unfiltered thing, because there's things in there that, you know, aren't incredibly flattering of like her her ancestors, right, of her. I mean, there's, and herself too, there's things where you're like, we all do these things, we all feel this way, we all make these, you know, errors and judgment or behavior. There's no perfect people in this book, you know, there's no perfect action,
which I think is an important thing to have done, because I mean, I've read a lot of books about this time period, and I've been leaning more in the last, I don't know, decade or so into looking specifically for books that were more like memoirs or that were like a family history or things like that, because I started noticing how romanticized this period can get. And I didn't notice it as much when I was younger, but it definitely started to hit me more, especially in like the last, I don't know, 10, 15 years. Like, why are we romanticizing this? Like, there's nothing romantic about it. It's not beautiful. It's awful. And it should be portrayed in a more realistic way, I think. So
I think beautiful things
appreciated it.
Yeah, like I think definitely beautiful things happen at all times of history, and in between people, and people make the best of things, and that's all amazing about people.
Yes.
But I agree with you that I think for those of us who don't have an experience of it, I think books like this are really important, because it is this like I said, like the mundane, it is the insidiousness of like how normal it all is until a horrific thing happens. You know, like how normal like the days are and the reactions of other people are. And I think those questions need to be had, like the dinner conversation that they were having at her boyfriend's house, where the younger generation was like, but would you stand up for these people who you think are at most at risk now, and things like that, you know, like these, is it about identity, or is it about anyone who's being marginalized, or, you know, like that kind of stuff. Like, what will you do if it really is your neighbor, or if it really is like someone in your school, or yeah, it's so interesting. And her shock at that principal scene where she has this whole conversation in her head about how she's going to placate him, and how she's going to be like, oh, it's going to be, you know, don't worry, I don't need there to be a big response. And then there totally isn't any response. And she's just left, you know, shocked by the indifference to
I thought that was a really like embarrassing, like I felt not embarrassed, I don't know if that's the right word, but I felt like she should have known better. But like, you don't expect that. You expect them to be on your side and hear what you're saying, and so often they're just like, no.
That was, I could feel that prickliness, you know, that whole encounter would have engendered that feeling of disbelief and indignation, but also it's happening too fast to say any of the right things. So it's a classic, you know, you'll be thinking about it for years to come and what you could have done differently. It was an important book. I really think it was, it's like you said, it's an important book, particularly for a time such as this.
Yeah. I did find some reading guide questions, but there's a lot. So I don't think we're going to go through all of them because it's just an overwhelming amount of discussion questions here. But let me see if there's anything that we haven't touched on. Okay, so it says French authors popularized what is known in the United States as autofiction. Authors like Emily Northam, Emmanuel Carrère, Annie Ernaux, and now Anne Berest. The Postcard is largely true, yet it is still classified as a novel. Where do you think fact and family history end and fiction begins in this book? How is it different from what readers typically expect from a memoir? And yeah, I had a lot of time thinking about like, what would you classify this book as? Because I know it says it's a novel, but it doesn't feel accurate to call it a novel. But it's also didn't feel right to call it a memoir because it's not about her. I mean, it is, but it's also so much about her family. So I've been struggling to figure out how to classify this book.
I think it is a different category, right, than either of those. It's almost like
I don't think I've read anything like that before.
Yeah, like I was definitely expecting a novel because, and like, I don't know. I think there should be a category, right, for like a memoir that very much remains like more factual, like a memoir would be, but because I think it's much more like a memoir than a novel. It's only not a memoir in the sense that it's not her own memories, like it's not her own personal birth to death kind of, trajectory, right?
I mean, there were moments that I'm like, okay, but you couldn't really have known what they said, like the conversation. So like those elements I feel could be construed as fiction, even though that's probably pretty close to what would have happened. But yeah.
It's almost like reconstructing like your own family's history, right? You can, extrapolate from these letters and from things you've heard and people's stories, but you're not actually. It was very little, I thought, where she would put in these feelings. And I thought it was mostly for like her, her grandmother and her great grandparents, like this kind of the people who are no longer here to ask, she would inject meaning into different imaginary conversations and things. But also, I'm sure some of those things, like we have memories, right, of grandparents and parents and saying these little stories from here and there and piecing things together and this feeling of what must have been.
I just thought it was amazing that they were able to find out as much as they were, because like there's stuff that I know of in my family's history that nobody would talk about, and now they're dead. And so like we'll never know. Like my grandfather on my father's side was in the military. So he was one of the groups that liberated a concentration camp. But I didn't know that until after he died. And I was like, are you serious?
Yeah.
Like, how did I not know? Like, because I was like deeply obsessed with the Holocaust growing up, like probably an unhealthy amount of obsession when I was like 12 to 15. And I would have loved to have had a conversation with him about that and just know more about it. But he was so horrified by it. Yeah. Like he told my aunt, I guess, a little bit about it, like right before he died. And I'm like, oh my God, I had no idea. So like there's so much stuff that people just take with them to the grave, and to be able to unearth this amount of stuff about your family's past and what happened to them. I don't know. I found it amazing because like I will never know some things, and I kind of wish that I could find things out now, but I don't even begin to know how to go about it.
Yeah, me too. I mean, especially, like for where I was born in India, like, even my birth certificate and hospital certificates, they're handwritten, I mean, and I don't know. I think there's lots of, I've asked before my grandmother passed away, I had asked her certain things and she didn't know, like
Mhm.
certain details about her own history, like about like, exactly when or where things happened. I mean, she was like one of like, double digit number of children. I always get
Mm.
confused whether it was like 13 or not, or less, like whether she was the eldest of 13 or whether there was like 13 after her. I don't know. But I don't know. I think it's interesting, especially when you come from a culture that doesn't have records past like in a grandparent's generation. How do you
Mm.
piece this together? So,
Yeah.
author's perspective.
Well,
I
also,
do
I think I found out who this is on the cover is Noemi.
know me. Yeah,
Yeah.
I looked that up too because I was
'Cause
so
I was
fascinated.
like, who am I looking at? Who is this?
Yeah, yeah.
So yeah.
They described like the Mongolian features
Hmm.
that she had at one point, like the high
Yeah.
cheekbones and the round.
Like I thought it might have been, but I wanted to find out for sure. So I
Yeah,
had to go
I
and
looked it
check
up
it out.
too. It's like
Yeah.
I have to know. She's quite beautiful,
Yeah.
but no. That portion of Noemi's story too was really hard to listen to,
Mm.
um, because it does end so abruptly, and that is how
Yes.
things ended, right? So abruptly.
Hmm.
And I thought that was very realistically done too.
And
Like,
again, one of those like decision moments where if she had gone this direction, she'd still be alive. But she went, yeah. The number of families that tried not to separate themselves and
mhm,
therefore they all died
yeah,
is tragic. But
yeah.
like, how do you know? You don't know it makes sense to go and try to stay together.
I can't imagine separating from like a younger sibling, like I think
Yeah.
I would do everything I could to stay together because you have this instinct, right? Like
Hmm.
if I'm there, then, they're that much safer. So,
Yeah.
but that's why, I mean, even that story you were saying about the mom and the kid, like the strength it takes to hide your children and to separate yourself from them and to entrust them to, that
Yeah.
unknown versus the one with you where you're like standing right over them until your last breath, that's,
Especially when they're such small children, they're like
yeah,
a baby. Like they're not going to remember you now, and you have to just hope that
yeah,
you get to see them again. That's
I can't.
hard to think about.
Yeah. Oh, I should look at the photos. So I didn't know you could find the other photos described in the book, like the ones
Ooh.
she has with her father and things like
Ooh, I'm
that.
gonna have to go look for that. Yeah.
Yeah, that was.
I always want to know what people look like reading a story, especially if they're real people. I'm like, I need to visualize this.
Mhm. The sheer chance of it all that saved her grandmother. I mean,
Ah, yes,
random teenage romance.
fascinating. Like again, it's like all those little choices that you make, and you don't know where those choices will lead.
Mhm.
And yeah, I thought that was really interesting, seeing how people managed to survive the war. That's something I'm always interested to read more about, like people who survived it and like how they managed to survive.
Yeah, I think their parents thought. I don't know that their parents ever knew, right?
No,
But
I think the parents just wanted to be where they were. They just were so anxious to be together again that they were willing to give themselves up, basically, because they just couldn't live with themselves not knowing.
yeah.
But I don't think that they assumed the children had died. I think that they just assumed wherever they were brought, they would also be brought, and then they'd be together again.
I think it's very hard to assume someone has died no matter what until you have proof, which must have been such a hard thing for people who never found out conclusively.
Mm-hmm.
Because, like, even when she's searching for her sister, Miriam's searching for her sister, and she
Mm-hmm.
just has this feeling like this is going to be it. Like, this where you have all of that, like, hope and, like, that's how we all feel, right? Like, we
Yeah.
have this feeling like this magical moment is going to be my moment, like, like our moment, like this means something. And it's just, I
Yeah.
think, our intense hope that it will be the good news. And then based on that, I can totally understand never wanting to talk about any of this ever again because,
Oh, yeah.
you just
Just want to pretend it never happened and get on with your life and not have to think about it. Yeah.
I also thought that was very touching when the mother described her interactions with her grandparents on their visit from Palestine, and also like Anne Berest's own interactions with her grandmother Miriam, like this grandparent interaction that we have, where like it's a whole different like it's people who are not sharing their trauma with you, like they're truly like
Mm-hmm.
doing the simple good things, like this is how we dry herbs, and this is how we do this, and this is how we make this food. And I think it's a very interesting universal experience with grandparents where they have this
Mm-hmm.
chance with these little people who are being taken care of by other people for the most part. And they just try to have the good experiences, like the good, simple moments. So,
Yeah. I'm just looking through the questions to see if there's anything we haven't talked about. Oh, this is a good one. Anne Berest thinks of works of literature as living memory. Do you think all works of literature, even ones less personal than the postcard, become a living memory of something or someone?
do we think all what?
All works of literature can
Mm.
become a living memory of someone or something. I don't know that I would say all works of literature, but then again, I don't know. I mean, that's an interesting question. As a person who reads a lot, I think maybe because like I tend to think more about fictional people than real ones sometimes.
Yeah,
So
it's like they have
maybe.
existed. I've had dreams of continuations of stories that I've read or prehistories, and literally not been sure whether I read them or made them up. And I've talked about them with friends, and they're like, no, that was nowhere to be found in this book or in this story or even in a show. And I'm like, really? Because I have this whole scene like clearly in my memory. And I think that that's interesting because whether or not it actually happened, well, two things. Whether or not it actually happened, I think once they've been read and absorbed and kind of brought to life in someone's mind, there is this like thing, right, informing you. Like I would never say that it was only real stories or nonfiction that has
Mm,
informed how I live my life. I mean, very like to a great extent, it has been the fictional characters that have informed, you know,
yeah.
how I would like to show up. Um, but then also another thing, I think that, when you observe something, even people who aren't related to you or in your daily life, like people on the bus or people in a store, or some random interaction you witness, I think a lot of that ends up in books also, for fictional
Mhm.
characters. So in that way, those are living memories of people who might not have been directly linked to that author's life, but they're still wandering around somewhere, you know. So,
Definitely. Yeah.
yeah. I definitely put down this book at certain points. I mean, like, like I had to stop listening to the Audible at certain points to because it became too sad, like in
Mhm.
the way that a day becomes too heavy. It
Yeah.
felt like that, where you like it wasn't the whole weight of everything. It was like I don't know, like she really did convey like the heaviness of like living through it, as opposed to an
Mhm.
abstract historical event
Yeah.
that was horrible in its own right. I think the weight of days was conveyed very, very well.
It was. Yeah. Yeah, there was definitely moments that I needed to like take a minute and just like step away from the story.
Yeah.
Because it was getting too, and I don't want to say it was getting too depressing, but it was. I've read more depressing things before, but it was just like too real.
Yeah, it was a real weight. The way of like I don't know. The way that real life is, right? At times. Like where you feel like this is too much to bear. Genuinely. For my own sake, for my own ordinary life. You know, like for their own ordinary life. Not because of everything that was happening. Not because like an entire nation fell or whatever yesterday, but like because she didn't know whether her husband was coming back or not today. You know, this like this thing. So
yeah, I agree with that. The children, reading stories with my children and having those people in the stories become part of our conversation and how we talk about things. Yeah, I definitely do that a lot.
For sure.
I also thought it was weird. Like I had a lot of dreams with French. I was reading with Regina, we were reading The Mona Lisa Vanishes, which also has a lot of French names and things in it. And so those two books, like, I don't know, I was dreaming in French and feeling frustrated that I didn't understand.
The whole thing. Dreaming in French. That should be the title of a book you write.
I'm trying to see if there's anything I wrote down that we didn't talk about yet.
That was you with Atomic Anna. Dude, that's funny. A book that if I stopped paying attention to I was listening to that one too, and I was like, if I stopped for, you know, a little bit, like all of a sudden I was like, second, who am I? Like what? What period am I in? And who is talking? So the end when she started switching perspectives more often, I was like,
yeah.
Oh, I lost the thread.
I thought this was a really good audiobook too. This is like one of my favorite audiobooks I've listened to this year. I don't know, it just flowed really well.
Yeah. This one I definitely wish I had the paper copy as well, because there were certain times where I deliberately went back in the audiobook just to like get a name or whatever. I started dropping way more bookmarks and flags because, you know, I just wanted to remember where are we now and what happened to who. And so
I definitely want to reread it and annotate because I was going to do that, and then I started the audio before I picked up my physical copy, and I was like, I can't just start annotating a quarter of the way in.
Yeah.
So I decided I'll have to wait and reread it at some point because there were so many moments that I was like, should I tab that? Should I go back and try to find that line? Yeah.
Did you read I'm sure you have, but The Tattooist of Auschwitz?
I almost read it. I had it, and I ended up getting rid of it before I ever got around to reading it.
Oh, so, really?
Yeah, I never got to it.
Was there a reason or?
I had heard someone say that it was a very romanticized story, and I just decided I didn't really want to read that. So I ended up getting rid of it.
I don't know that it was very romanticized. It was definitely more romanticized than this, but I don't think it was that romanticized, honestly. It was, I wanted to say that the most moving part about it for me was the end where it's like the author's note, because it was a non-Jewish author.
Yeah.
That, you know, the main character had hired, right, to write his story and the conversation between the two of them, I thought was the most moving part. So if you ever do see it in the bookstore or whatever, read the author's note at the end.
I'll do that.
They found it very similar in tone in that to like Miriam almost, like or even her mother, like in that, like to tell the history properly, you kind of want it to be devoid of like this like huge dramatic note. Like you want to tell it the way it happened. Like, I think the horror of it all lies in the ordinary details of it,
Yeah.
not in the grand, like, the big moments. It's like the kind of continuous march of small horror. Like, so.
I definitely recommend looking for We Were the Lucky Ones. It's on TV right now on Hulu. They adapted it, but that was a really good one. And and again, it had the whole like decision-making process, like where is the best place to go? Should we leave? Should we stay with our home? Like, should we fight for our country and our place here and all of that? So yeah, there was a lot of moments of decision, and it's set in Poland, which is like you want to get out of Poland if you can. So yeah.
Where was your family from?
My family was from Russia and Lithuania.
Okay.
And some of them went to Hungary before they came over, but most of my family left during the pogroms in like the early 1900s, so they weren't in Europe, thankfully, for when it got really bad. But I know I had some family that stayed, because my grandmother would mention in passing little stories about how, I don't know, her uncle or somebody would wake up screaming in the night a lot, and he was the only one who survived from his family, and like that's all I know.
Yeah.
So yeah.
That must have been, for the people who were like lone survivors and things, that must have been just, I don't know, to continue must have been so unbearably hard.
Yeah. Did you watch, what is it called? I keep mistitling it. A Small Light? Is it A Small Light or A Little Light? I can never remember which one it is. That was on Disney, I think. And I think it was also on Hulu at the same time. But it's the story of Miep Gies, who helped to hide the Frank family.
Oh, no.
So it's Anne Berest
I did hear about it.
Perspective. Yeah. That was a really good show. Like, I watched it with Rob, and then immediately upon finishing it, I was like, nope, watching it again with Regina. So I watched it with Regina. It was a really well done story, and I liked how much agency it gave the Frank family. But seeing like Otto Frank coming home and finding out that he was the only one was really sad. And like the hopefulness of like, well, maybe they'll be back soon, and waiting and trying to find out what happened. Yeah. But I highly recommend watching that. That was a really, really good series. I think it's only like 8 episodes or 10 episodes. I can't remember how long the season was, but it was really good.
Yeah, I agree. That part where the mother was so mad, like that anger, that, kind of searing rage.
Yeah.
We're going to go to all the neighbors' houses, and we're going to get our things back.
Yeah, the fact that the guy was like, oh, they're all dead, so it doesn't matter. They didn't have any descendants. It's like, actually, yeah.
Right in front of you.
I just can't imagine going door to door and being like, do you remember these people? Like, I don't know. I don't think I could do that. I'm not good at talking to strangers. And especially with something that emotional, I don't think I could do it.
I don't know what I would do if somebody said no, like, no, you can't come in the garden. No, you can't look around. It's funny. My grandparents had my maternal grandparents had a fairly large house because they had 8 kids, and they moved into it when my mother was like a teenager. And so I was born in that, like, grew up when I was little. And after my grandparents passed away, the girls inherited the house, the 3 girls, and they decided to sell it for businesses and stuff. So now it's like a business complex almost. And I remember seeing it the last time I went to India was quite a while ago because it was right before I got married. And it was so hard for me to see the house as something else.
That would be very weird. Yeah.
It was so hard for me to see it as not, I don't know, as not mine. Like it was very like personal and strange, and like I cried. It was this whole thing. And I remember being like, I was unprepared for how hard it was to see it as not mine. But that was probably the closest I can come to something like this, where it's like, I don't know, so much history that happened in a place that should by all rights still be your family's, you know?
Yeah.
It wasn't even like a forcible seizure or like a loss. It was just not ours anymore, but it was still very, very hard. So interesting.
Okay. Do we have anything else that we didn't talk about that we want to touch on? I think we've hit everything I had in my notes.
Yeah, I think this is a must read, though. I think, it's one of those books where I think even if you're, because I know people who will not read books about the Holocaust, not because they, you know, are in any way like Holocaust deniers or anything like that. They just, it's too sad. Like they're like, this is not why I'm reading books. But I think that, you know, there are times in that I don't think people have to read every single book about the Holocaust or have to read like all the nonfiction books about every disaster that ever happened. But I think there are certain really important books about any one period in history, and I think this is one of them.
I agree. Yeah.
It talks about, I don't know, like you said, it does not romanticize it, but it talks very frankly and honestly about like how horrific everything was and also how ordinary.
How ordinary it was, how like slow the build was. I think it was important going back to like 1918 and like seeing all these small events start to happen, and like the decisions people had to make for themselves, and like the people who were warning them and trying to help them to get out, and like, I don't know, the fact that the Ephraim, I think, was the one who was talking to the woman he used to be in love with, and when she was like, you should go, we're going to America, you should get out, and then he was like, no, because you said it, I'm gonna stay, and I'm not gonna listen to you, you're being crazy,
you still think you're better than me somehow, like this weird,
like, no, that was a very important warning and you didn't heed it. And yeah, like all of those little moments. I think this is a book that everyone should read. I think it's very readable too, so it's not like handing somebody this complex tome like, now you'll know everything about this event, but I think it gives enough information to paint an accurate picture of the course of events, and also like
the timeline. I thought that it was a very good way of interjecting one person's history in a very coherent timeline of events. Like she pulled out, I think, really important global events that directly impacted them at exactly the right, you know, like, because it's the way it happened, but like at exactly the right times, like I don't know, where it all makes more sense to what must have been happening to the people involved rather than just the borders. You know, because when we study about it, like we study about the camps, right? Like when you're in school and stuff, and you study about, you know, the people who left before and the finding of the people, but you don't ever really study about the war in context of all of that.
Exactly. Yeah. So
I think completely separate from, you know, these borders.
And I think that is such an important element to these stories, to know like what was happening everywhere else too, and like it puts it into a different context than so many books do.
Yeah. Even the ordinariness of like how people must have like been in the resistance and stuff, you know, like this extreme danger, but also like these very, very ordinary people doing these very, very ordinary things, like even accepting the postcards and things like that with the upside down stamps and these symbols, but the risk that they put themselves at to do any of those things, even the the very basic.
And I think that's a really interesting thing to show, because I think a lot of people hear resistance and they see big moments like the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and like, sure, that is a resistance, but there's also so many small things that you could do that seem so ordinary and mundane, like listening to radio reports and like using stamps to show different, like those are so small you wouldn't even think about them. Most people probably wouldn't have even noticed, but and
then it went from like, I thought this book also did a good job, because people do ask all the time, like, how did everyone let this happen? Like, how did they not, this like slowness of like stepwise
it's that slow desensitizing, like when little things start happening and it just feels ordinary, you don't really think about it very much, and it has nothing to do with you, so why would you need to know more? And
I think there's a real period where people were like, well, when the parties change or when this happens, it's just until the next election, it's just until the next, there was this feeling of like, well, so I can't go to the movies, like it's like so I can't do this thing or that thing, but I can do everything else.
And the idea that it's just something happening in Germany, it's not going to affect us here. We're in France. France is fine, and like you're right next to Germany. Like you're so close to them. It's the idea that it could never happen here. So you just sort of ignore it and you go on with your life. I think there was a scene where they were talking about how the war had started, but it didn't really feel like a war had started because our lives haven't really changed. And like, it's weird to think that like I'm going to school today or I'm working in the garden and there's a war happening nearby. And
I thought when she was talking about the teenage girls and how they were going about their ordinary lives, like that was very real. And when she's packing to go away for the first time with her brother, that first thing where they're separated from their parents, and she's like worried about like having left her lip gloss, like her pot of lip gloss, and that is a very ordinary worry when you pack and you think you're just going to be away for a little bit on like a work training.
I always have to remind myself when I'm reading things like this that like they didn't know. They could not have known what was about to happen to them. Like,
how can you imagine it? I mean,
you can't even visualize them like that. Like, you can know that bad things are happening and you can know that bad things have happened before, but you can't picture something like that.
Happening to you.
Yeah.
I think the turning a blind eye too, though, I think that this book gave me a perspective on that in a way that other books hadn't, because I think there was a lot that people could have done, but also I think it became scary very quickly all of a sudden.
It did. Like it was a slow build, but it was also very fast at the same time. Like things had been slowly building, and then all of a sudden, it was just all at once. And I don't know. I always wonder, like, why didn't more people help? But I can also see like the danger in that. Like if you help and you get caught helping, then you've just put your whole family at risk. And
even like the doctor at the camp and things like that, like the one who had Noemi as her assistant. Like you stand up for somebody and that's that, like, and I think those stories probably spread too. So
maybe want to go seek out her memoir and see what else happened. Like,
notebooks. It's
I'm glad I picked this for book club because I just had a feeling it was going to be a good discussion. Like, I just thought this would be good to talk about with people because I don't know. Sometimes when I read things on my own, I wish I'd had a person to talk to while I was reading it. So I just feel like this was a good book club pick. So I'm glad I saved it for this. I bought it like right after it came out, and then I just kind of hoarded it because I didn't know when was the right time to read it.
And I think this is one of the, I mean, as someone who isn't Jewish, I think being not Jewish and talking to Jewish people about the Holocaust is always a tricky thing, like it really is, because I think no one wants to set a foot wrong. Like you don't want to say something that makes it sound callous. You don't want to equate it to other things. Horrible things have happened to many people throughout history.
Mm-hmm.
I think I was explaining this to my kids at one point. I was like, I think one of the things that's most horrifying about the Holocaust in particular, though, is exactly what this book captures. This like slow progression of like forms and regulations, and this very wasn't, like this active aggression of war where people were rounded up and that was it, or like
Mm-hmm.
just, a military kind of like action, right, against a people, like, which is horrifying and terrible and has happened. This was like, we are going to make ourselves feel good about it at the same time. Like, we're going to make you feel okay about it. Like, we're going to make you feel like it's not a big deal. We're going to make your neighbors feel, who might be sympathetic to you, like it's not a big deal. Until it really is a big deal and it's too late for anybody to do anything. Like, there was this very orderly, like, cooperative effort with, the internal governments of these places. Like, that kind of insidiousness, I think, is unique in a way. And it's always so, I don't know, unsettling to me that can happen in that way. It really wasn't overnight.
It wasn't. And like, so many people in so many countries were complicit, and like complicit in ways that you don't even consider complicit, like not letting people leave and not allowing people to come into your country and things like that. Mm-hmm. And like how hard it was to get out. Like the people who managed to leave, that was impossible. Like the sheer difficulty of getting out of Europe in that time. Like you were just one of the lucky few who made it out. Like, I don't know, so many little things building up and making it harder and harder to get out and escape. And I don't know. I think about these things a lot, like probably an unhealthy amount, but yeah, like, I don't know. I feel like I grew up hearing stories about it. Even though my family wasn't as touched by it as so many other people, because most of my family was already in America at that point. But just knowing about it and like hearing my grandparents and my parents talking about like, you need to be aware of things and always paying attention because you don't know when things are going to get bad, but they will. And just having to always like think in my head, like, is now bad? Is this the now? Like, should I be paying more attention because like I don't feel like I'm in danger, but could I be in danger? So
it's interesting because my husband's always a little more sensitive to these things than I am. I mean, having had a mom who's like a Peter Pan baby, and that whole thing that that's only one generation removed, right, from someone literally sending their kids away. So I'm just like blissfully like la la la, like for generations and generations, my family was in one place in India. And we come from a pretty peaceful area of South India, and at least when I was growing up and stuff. And I don't know, where everyone kind of got along, and we had multiple faiths, and I think that I remember, bringing it to nowadays. I remember when Trump got elected, I was still breastfeeding. And I remember I was breastfeeding late at night, like something like 8:45 or 9, when you saw that vote count really like turn. And I remember being like, no. And we went to sleep, and like I woke up to breastfeed somewhere around the morning, like in the early morning hours, and it was completely gone, and crying. It was the first time something political had made me like just instinctively like sob, because it showed me a reality of a country that I've grown up in and that I love, that I was for, like a truth flat out in numbers that I had not realized. Like and I think it's those realizations, right? Like that, I think we wander around a lot. Like when I think of these people who didn't do anything, whether they were Jewish or not, like there is this instinct to believe that the world is the way you want it to be.
Yeah.
and that the world is the way you are and your friends are. And like,
Mhm.
and I think
Yeah.
facing up to the fact that it may not be is always hard.
Yeah. I mean, I always want to have the optimistic view of things. Like, I always try to force myself to be optimistic.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not an optimistic person, but I try to be one because um, Anne Frank left like this imprint on me as a small, like, little kid. And I just like try really hard to find that in everything. But like, it's hard. It's hard to be optimistic, and it's hard to not look at people around me and wonder, like, are you a safe person? Because
Yeah.
like, I don't know. Um, yeah, it's a hard truth to know that like there's a lot of people who will turn on you and who will not even really think about the fact that they're turning on you because it's just what you do. So yeah.
I had never lived in the country until a few years ago, where before we moved into this house, we lived, I mean, in the country. We had to drive like 15 minutes to get to
Mhm.
like a stoplight, like it was, I'll call that the country. And I remember there's a bunch of houses that you would pass on the way to that stoplight where it was just like large American flags, like car
Mm,
dealership size, where I was like,
yeah.
like if I broke down, like I think I would just wait. I don't think I would go to any of your houses because I don't know how you feel about brown people, and
Yeah.
that was a weird feeling to even have that slight prickle of unease, and maybe some of them would have been great, I'm not
Yeah.
saying that. I'm just saying that, we have, it's a time of symbols and symbolism and all of these things that people are putting
Mhm.
in for their houses and their cars, and all the arguing about flags and which flag do you have and what type, and like, do you have the
Mhm.
centennial flag or do you have the new flag, or do you, like all of these
Yeah.
little coded things. And I don't know, when I think about symbology and like symbols saying who you are, obviously comes to mind, this like calling out
Mhm.
of who you are. So
Yeah. The town we live in is very conservative, and there's like a house just a couple blocks away that has like a gigantic Trump flag, like on
mhm,
their whole house. Like the whole side of their house is this giant flag, and I'm like, I don't like going by that house. It
yeah,
makes me anxious.
yeah.
Yeah.
Like, why, like, what motivates that? Like, I'm
I
not saying
don't
that every
know.
person who votes for Trump is like a bad person. I'm saying when you paint the side of your house that way,
Yeah, like I don't understand
yeah,
advertising it like that. I don't know. Like
yeah,
it immediately makes me uncomfortable with them. And I maybe they're delightful people. Maybe they're very kind. I don't know. But that makes
mhm,
me think otherwise, like
right,
it
yeah.
makes them feel unsafe.
It
Yeah.
makes me feel like they definitely want people to know that there's certain things they stand for, right? And
Hmm.
I think that's a fair assumption.
Yeah.
Um, so, you know, it's I want to know what Deidre has said a million times.
I saw that just now.
And I also I agree with the new perspective on a
Mm,
subject. Yeah, I think they
yeah.
want people to be uncomfortable. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
just don't, I can't understand that though. Like, why would you want people to be uncomfortable around you? Like, I I am the first to say I'm not a people person. I tend to like would rather be alone than in a big group of people, but like I would not want to make someone uncomfortable to
Yeah.
keep them away from me. Like I
Yeah.
don't understand that mentality.
I don't even know if they want to keep, I don't know if it goes so far as to like keep people away from you. I feel like
Is it
it
like
is
a
that.
bat signal? Like they're trying to
Yeah.
bring their people in. I don't even that though. Like if you know.
I think they also want to like, I think it's like a call to power, like this idea of like, look how brave I am. Like I can say the thing that, I'm not supposed to say. Like I'm not
Yeah.
afraid to say the things. Like, I don't know. Because no matter what, I definitely think there's awareness of what you're not supposed to say,
Mm,
being said right now. And I think there's this weird pride in like being the person who says the gross thing out loud.
yeah.
And that's
I find that so
disturbing.
strange. Like I
Yeah.
don't know. I
Yeah.
can't wrap my brain around it.
Yeah. It's know, it's funny. I have a teenage son who got his first phone at Christmas, and he was the only 8th grader without a phone. Blah blah blah. It was the first year he's gone to school, right? So, um, and I've definitely seen some conversations. Like I'm not like always reading text messages or anything, but occasionally we have this open policy. Like if I want to see your phone, I get to see your phone.
Mm-hmm.
And there has been conversations where I'm a little horrified at the way teens in particular and teen boys in particular can talk about different groups of people and stuff like that. And I think, part of that is teenagehood and part of that's how it's always been. And you can see my son pushing back, but in this funny teenage way, where I'm just like, you should be pushing back much harder. And my husband's like, you have to let them, kind of feel out their humor and whatever and yada yada. And he's on the right side of it most of the time. But I'm like, is that enough, really? Like, is that enough? Like, I don't know. Like, I don't know. Like, I'm navigating this at the first time. But that's one of the things I liked about this book was that it is all that navigation of, like, being a parent in the midst of this crisis, and then in the aftermath of this crisis. And you're still dealing with all your trauma, Those things don't go away. Like, even her own, like, family thing where she was so uncomfortable to say, Anne herself at dinner, like, oh yeah, this happened. My daughter told me about it, but I haven't done anything about it yet. And everyone's just like horrified, like, what? Like, you haven't done anything? Like, you haven't asked her about it? And I mean, I think we're all living in real time, right, as these things unfold. So it is something. So yeah, I agree with Deidre there. And Eric. Yeah. They're saying exactly what we think they are. Yeah, I don't know that we need to give my husband's always like, I don't know that we need to give everyone credit and be like, they might be nice people. They're not nice people. So,
I don't like thinking badly of people, but also if you're going to put stuff like that out into the world, then people are going to think things of you. I don't know.
Yeah. I don't know. My father, he worked with another physician who is African American, and like the HOA, like someone in the HOA, like put a notice in his mailbox that was like very racist and all of this stuff. And I was like, these are trying times too, like that is an odd thing to have happen in United States of America, but perhaps not anymore,
Yeah.
But
I'm glad we read this. Like, I feel like I'm glad I saved it for book club. I think this was a good one to discuss. Like, sometimes I pick books and I'm like, I want to read this and I think it'll be fun, but will we have anything to talk about?
Yeah.
I like that every now and then I end up finding a book that is like the perfect book club book. So yeah, I feel like that is what this book is. It's almost meant for group reading because you kind of feel like you have to talk to somebody as you're reading it.
Yeah, I was talking to my kids about it and they weren't reading it, but they would listen to like parts of it. And my kids are too young for this book for sure. But I was like, I find myself being like, this happened. And can you imagine this happening? Can you imagine it happening to you? And I think it's a very important book for that feeling. Like, can you imagine this happening to you?
Yeah. Yeah, I was describing a lot of it to my husband, and he was just like, why do you read this stuff? And I'm like, because I have to. Like, it's important.
Based on how many books you've read about the Holocaust, you can say that a lot.
He's like, Emily, you should stop. I was like, no. But yeah, because like I'm making him watch We Were the Lucky Ones with me. And he's like, they're always the same. Why do you need to keep watching this? And I'm like, it's not though. Like, everyone's story is different.
Did I ever tell you I made my husband read Bridge to Terabithia in med school because he hadn't? And he was like, he called me and he was like, why did you do this to me? He was like, I was living so happily and now this.
I always think it's interesting how people react to that book, because I remember reading it and just like, I thought it was great. I loved it. And I made all my kids read it. And each one of them had a different reaction. Like Sarah was mad at me about that book. She's like, I cannot believe you did this to me. She's like, I thought I was getting a fun, happy book, and it was not. And I was like, no.
Exactly. Yeah. I was like, I just thought it was an amazing book. And I was like, you should not have not read this book. This is an obvious hole in your education. And he was horrified. He called me the moment he finished. like
that
what?
book almost needs a warning, because like I find it interesting how many people didn't know what they were getting into reading that book. Like I didn't prepare Sarah. I should have. I prepared the rest of my kids after that. Like, by the way, this is going to get sad. So.
Oh, I didn't say anything like that.
I didn't to Sarah, and she was so mad about it. Like,
yeah.
I was like, okay, I think I prefaced it for her, but like, this is a really good book and you should read it. And so, yeah. She wasn't ready.
Are you ever ready for that book? I don't know. I mean, it'll be very shocking to anyone who sees the movie and then reads the book. So, because I've heard the two have nothing to do with each other. I only heard the movie playing in the.
I don't know if I've actually seen the movie. I feel like I must have, but I don't remember it. So maybe not.
No, but it's entirely different. I mean, I've only heard it, so I can't be entirely sure. But
I remember the trailer when it came out, and I was upset because they made it into like this cute fantasy story, and I'm like, people are going to be so mad.
So mad.
To take their small children to see this. Yeah.
And the whole point of that book is that it's not a fantasy story. I like, you know, like,
yeah.
So I don't know. Even the happy part, the whole point is that it's not a fantasy. Like
the way they advertise movies sometimes baffles me, because there's been multiple times that I'm like, you're presenting this in a light that it should not be presented in. You're gonna.
I always imagine the first person who wrote the like screenplay or the adaptation, they had this very faithful thing, and they're like, "How about we throw in some animatronics?" Like, they're like, why must we really? So, but what is next month?
Oh, yep. Next month we are reading Theater of Marvels, and this one is a Victorian London, like, but from the Black experience, which is really cool because I don't think I've ever seen that before. That's another time period I tend to read a lot of, is Victorian stuff, because I just find that a really interesting time to read about. But and also, like, I have this whole fantasy world I like to live in Victorian London, because I just think it's so pretty. I don't know why, but I live in a little Charles Dickens-y kind of world. But I've not seen anything in that time period from the Black experience. So I'm excited. I'm hoping that it's good. So
recommending that book with no warning is a new kind of chaos. Yeah. So that's what we're about here.
Yeah. I like to bring about just a little bit of chaos.
Yeah. So next month will be a little bit later of a time because of me, because I'm doing a book-related volunteering thing in the morning.
Yep. So we'll have our live at 4 instead of 1. So, and I'll put a note about that in the Discord, and I'll be mentioning it at least once or twice on Instagram, just so people are aware, since it'll be different from our usual. But yeah.
So, it was fun as always.
Yeah. Well, thank you guys so much for coming and talking about the book with us. It was a really great discussion, and we will see you next month. I think, what is it, the 4th? I keep trying to remember what the date is. The 4th. May the 4th. Yeah, that's easy to remember. So May the 4th at 4. There. Yeah. Perfect. Okay.
Thanks for joining us, everybody.
Yep. So thank you all for coming, and we'll see you next month. Happy reading. Bye.